My name is Jim Turk, and I'd like to welcome you to today's Center for Free Expression and Conversation. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which I'm speaking to you today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaty signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. On behalf of the Center for Free Expression and the Creative School at Ryerson University, we are delighted that you are able to join us in the fourth in the Center for Free Expression series, Taming Big Tech, Exploring the Alternatives. Our program today features Taylor Owen in conversation with Andrew Clement, on governing big tech in Canada. I would, before we start, I'd like to acknowledge and thank the co-sponsor for today's events. They are the Edmonton Public Library, the Ryerson Journalism Research Center, the Milton Public Library, the Toronto Public Library, and the Vancouver Public Library. I'd like to introduce our participants. Taylor Owen is one of Canada's leading thinkers on big tech's transformation of our economy, our society, and our lives, and what we might do about that. He is the Beaverbrook Chair in Media, Ethics, and Communications, the founder director of the Center for Media, Technology, and Democracy, and an associate professor at the Max Bell School of Public Policy at McGill University. He is the host of the Center of Information Governance's Big Tech podcast, where he is also a senior fellow. Welcome, Taylor.
Thanks for having me.
In conversation with Taylor is Andrew Clement. Andrew is Professor Emeritus in the Faculty of Information at the University of Toronto, where he coordinates the Information and Policy Research Program and co-founded the Identity, Privacy, and Security Institute. With a PhD in computer science, Andrew has had a long-standing research and teaching interests in the social implications of information communication technologies and participatory design. Welcome, Andrew.
Hello, and glad to be here.
For today's program, after about 45 to 50 minutes of conversation between Taylor and Andrew, we will turn to the audience to bring you into the conversation. As you listen to their conversation, if you have questions at any point that you would like to address when we turn to the audience, please just click on the Q&A tab that you see at the bottom of your screen. And write in your question as it comes to you. So you don't have to wait till we get to the audience and turn to you formally, but just put your questions as they come to mind as you listen to the conversation. And then, as I say, in 45 to 50 minutes into the conversation, we'll bring you into it. I think that's really all I have. And so I'd like to turn it over to Taylor and Andrew.
Well, thank you, Jim. And welcome, Taylor, and welcome to all those out in Zoomland, wherever you may be. I'm reaching you from my home on Canada's west coast in the unceded territory and ancestral homelands of the Salish-speaking people. I live near Victoria, which memorializes the imperial monarch in whose name this territory was stolen to establish what we now call British Columbia. We're able to have this conversation thanks to a remarkable digital network whose physical features belie its popular characterization as a placeless cloud. In North America, at least, the fiber optic cables that carry the signals between us still follow the routes of the 19th century telegraph lines that ran alongside the railways that colonial agents pushed through lands of countless First Peoples. The digital switching centers are mainly located in big featureless buildings at the core of our largest cities, right near where these railways met in the 19th century. This high degree of physical centralization of critical network infrastructure has greatly facilitated our national security agencies, the NSA in the US and CSE in Canada, to intercept all our internet communication and selectively monitor it for perceived threats to national security. Last spring, we began the Taming Big Tech series with 3 events to open up a discussion of the challenges that big tech poses socially, economically, politically, and culturally. We also began exploring alternatives to current tech structures and practices that might better suit the ideals of a just and equitable democracy. In the months since beginning this discussion, its urgency and importance have grown even more evident. Controversies over big tech corporate behavior feature almost daily in our news media. Facebook is currently the most prominent bad boy, but it better represents the tip of an iceberg than an isolated bad apple. And after decades of neglect, governments are now feeling public pressure to do something about big tech and are proposing legislative measures aimed at reining in its more egregious harms. While well-intentioned, these government initiatives are often long overdue, yet done too hastily to effectively address the underlying issues and even risk making matters worse. One example of this we'll discuss later is the federal government's online harms bill announced in July. To bring attention to what is happening in Canada and what we might do about it, this second season of Taming Big Tech will take national digital policy making as a central theme. Some of the bigger questions we'll explore include what would constitute a positive vision of a just, sustainable, and digitally enabled Canadian society? What can Canadians individually, collectively, or governmentally do to help achieve such a vision? What is the scope of government action in meeting the challenges of big tech and pursuing this vision? I could go on, but you get the idea. These are almost laughably broad topics to get our heads around. So we'll focus in on specific debates in such hot areas as speech, privacy, competition, democratic governance, cybersecurity, national sovereignty. But we'll do it hopefully with a series of experts in these various areas. At the same time, we'll try to draw out the important strands that connect them so we can address the challenges of big tech in the holistic manner it calls for. To launch this second series and provide a guide to the broad landscape of governing big tech in Canada, I can't think of anyone more suitable than our guest today, Taylor Owen. To my mind, Taylor is one of Canada's foremost academics and public intellectuals on the topic of big tech and digital governance more generally. As Jim has mentioned, he's a Beaverbrook chair in media and ethics and communication at McGill University. He's a founding director of the Center for Media, Technology and Democracy, which examines how media and emergent technologies shape democracy. With former Supreme Court Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin, he co-chairs the Canadian Commission on Democratic Expression, which is taking on the daunting task to better understand, anticipate, and respond to the effects of new digital technologies in public life and Canadian democracy. Somehow, Taylor also finds time to host the Center for International Governance Innovations Big Tech podcast, now about to begin its 4th season. I recommend you check it out. It begins again on November 25th. So with that, welcome, Taylor.
Thank you so much.
And
it's a pleasure to be here with you. With you of all people, I've know these issues intimately and have worked on them for much longer than I have. So it's going to be fun to talk it through.
Yes, well, I'm looking forward to that. I've been thinking about these things for longer than you have, perhaps, but I'm really impressed by the depth and activity. I feel I've more tinkered with them than what I see you doing now. So I'm a fan. Since we're trying to lay some sort of broad landscape here before diving into the details, I'd like to set the stage by pinning down some basic understandings of core terms.
Okay.
So let's start with big tech. What do you think is a useful meaning of the term big tech in the context of public policy making? I mean, that term is used widely. We capitalize it. You use it a lot. I mean, your podcast, but it's both in some ways an ambiguous, a sort of broad and baggy term, and there's also a question of whether big tech is a coherent enough sort of entity in order to think about policy, because companies are different. So I'd really welcome your thoughts on that.
No, I mean, I think it's as you say, a very loose constellation of variables that maybe connect a certain, a relatively small number of companies into that sort of label. And I'm actually not sure in and of itself it's that helpful, frankly. I think thinking about potentially platforms is maybe much more useful, because that's something we can define much more specifically. And when we start to talk about that, we can talk about like the ways in which users are enabled to post their own content in these places, or a layer of sort of infrastructure that might emerge on top, or that enables that kind of behavior. But I think at the moment, when we talk about big tech in sort of the popular parlance, what we really mean is the 5 to 7, mostly, well, in this case, American technology companies that have really scaled to become this sort of platform layer on top of the internet over the past decade. Most began as social media, having some social media dimensions to them, all create marketplaces and allow for a certain amount of user agency to participate in them. And all have become, I mean, let's not forget the big element of this, they have become some of the largest companies in human history. So when we look at Amazon, Google, Facebook, these are some of the largest, most profitable companies we've ever seen. And so that the big aspect of it is something important as well, I think, because it changes the nature of a company and how countries might engage with those companies when you get companies at this global scale, which historically has always happened, obviously. But this is something slightly new here, I think. The nature of these companies, the nature of how they make money, and the pure scale of participation in their platform activity is something a little bit different than we've seen before, I think.
Yeah, well, I quite agree that thinking of them as platforms is probably a more useful way of than just calling them big tech companies. And I'd like to get into that. But before looking at platforms, I want to sort of call out or get your reaction to a couple of other aspects that you've touched on lightly. So you've mentioned size. I mean, they are the largest, but companies in history, but by quite a bit. So that, for instance, the big five, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, and Microsoft. Microsoft often gets left out of it, but it is one of the true giants. I mean, collectively, we're worth $7 billion at the end of last year, and they had almost doubled that as capital of market capitalization during the COVID time. So there's something really remarkable going on there. And in terms of power, and you've commented on this, they rival and even challenge major national governments in terms of what they want to do, as opposed to what democratic legislatures and administrations want them to do. So they're very unruly in some respects. And the other thing is you touched on is the sort of the nature of their business, and particularly drawing on Shoshana Zuboff's work, popularizing the term surveillance capitalism. They, Google in particular, and Facebook, but also in the other companies, have drawn upon a business model that has turned out to be extraordinarily lucrative and at the same time poses a lot of risk. I just wonder if you want to elaborate or comment on that, or
we could have our hour-long conversation about any one of those three. Look, I mean, a couple things, I guess. I mean, one on the notion that they compete against or behave like or act in conflict to nation states. I mean, I think that's often the case with large companies that would prefer to have one global set of rules and behaviors everywhere on the planet. That's of course that bumps up against how we govern ourselves, the national jurisdiction we impose on corporate activity, and always have. but that goes both ways with these companies. I mean, if I'm a citizen of a democratic nation, I might be concerned that some of these either values or norms of free speech, which we'll talk more about, I'm sure, are being imposed on me, and are difficult just by the nature of how they are being posed and how the speech is happening. They're difficult for my democratic government to govern. But if I'm a citizen in a liberal regime, I might actually prefer that that those norms of speech that are being enabled by these technologies. So I think we have to look at that sort of the tension with state governance from both angles, right?
Did you say liberal or illiberal?
Illiberal. Right? If I'm
illiberal.
in a liberal regime, I might prefer Facebook's definition of free speech or America's, right? The First Amendment notion of free speech that's embedded in the design and the norms that are facilitated by these platforms, these largely American platforms. I might prefer that American notion of free speech if I live in a liberal regime to the notion of free speech that's being imposed on me by my government.
Yeah.
And in that case, the fact that these are kind of supranational institutions might be seen as a positive to me. Now, if I live in a democratic society, I might think differently about that. I might want my government to be able to enforce its own norms of speech or commercial activity or political organization or whatever it might be, right? So that tension, I think, is really important between the types of behavior that's enabled by these technologies and the way in which we govern that kind of behavior in different kinds of regimes around the world. So I think that goes both ways.
Mm-hmm. I mean, just on that point, I mean, you mentioned recently in something you wrote earlier this year, in the case of Australia trying to impose or actually better support independent journalism by reining in the Facebook and Google in particular, and getting them to pay for some of the content that they make available to others but don't have to pay for. And I think you referred to that as a breathtaking example. I think this is your term, a breathtaking example of sort of repudiation of government, of democratic government. Yes, they demonstrated a breathtaking disdain for the democratic process.
Well, I mean, let's unpack that a little bit, I think, because that's an interesting case study here, I think, right? So we have a democratic government that we can agree with the policies they came up with or not. But they came up with a policy that basically said, we believe, based on reporting and documentation from our competition bureau, that there is lack of competition in the ad market that leads to an impossible negotiation position between our domestic newspapers, in this case, and these large platforms, who are essentially, they argued had a duopoly essentially on advertising.
Yeah,
and they said, look, like,
which is almost global,
right? I mean, yeah, we can debate just how big or small that is, and how big. I mean, that's a whole conversation, right? But regardless, the Australian government decided it was a problem that was leading to unfair negotiation inside their market, and it's entirely within their democratic right to correct for what they saw as that market failure, right? And so they imposed a correction, which in this case was forced arbitration, so forcing the platform companies to enter into arbitration with if they couldn't come up with good licensing deals with Australian publishers. And again, like I actually have lots of mixed feelings about that as a policy lever. What I have no mixed feelings about is that it's a legitimate act of democratic governance. And a lot of what you hear from these companies is that they want to be regulated, that they are open to these conversations. Well, not always, right? They're open to certain types of regulation, not all regulation, and as is their right. They act in their own interests. The government of Australia acts in a different set of interests, in their perceived interests of Australian citizens. And why I thought that moment was breathtaking was because the response from the companies was for almost a nuclear option, which was, if you go down this path, we will leave your market entirely. And that is their right. They are a private company that essentially sells a service and provides a service to us, to the Australian market, and it's their right to leave. But something else is going on, and this gets to kind of the nature of these companies and these services that you alluded to in your opening, which is that there's something more than just a product. They're embedded in our lives in some really important ways. They're embedded in our economy. They're embedded in our media. They've become sort of essential layers of infrastructure in the way we communicate and organize and function as an economy. And so to say we will just pull out that layer of this infrastructure if you impose what is your democratic right to do, to me, that's why I called it breathtaking. Yeah. It was really going to the line of on this particular issue. And why was that? And we could talk about why they went so far with that. But look, I think part of engaging in the regulatory and policy process is it's going to be at times things are imposed on you which aren't perfectly aligned with your corporate interests. It's your right to fight them, but I think we need to call it out when they do.
Yeah, no, that's very, very helpful. We'll get into those tensions of how democratic governments, Canada in particular, can exercise some degree of effective oversight and regulation. But what I'd like to pick up on first is your comments about how this has become, how their services and the platforms have become embedded within our daily lives and constitute now, in many ways, a sort of a vital part of everyday life, and also, our economy more generally. Yeah. So while we'll spend plenty of time criticizing big tech and what we can do about it, I'd like to take a moment at least to identify what the benefits that big tech has brought, because they're not inconsiderable. Yeah. And to me, they point to a number of what we might call infrastructural or public utility services across quite a wide range of activities in the digital realm that have not previously existed. And I'm thinking just two examples. I mean, of search in the case of Google, which was, and let's say various forms of social media that Facebook and Google and Twitter and others enable us to use as ways of communication that are unprecedented historically, of being able to, on a global basis, talk to each other in one-to-one or in groups and just in multiple ways that are really people have obviously responded to very positively. Facebook has over 3 billion regular monthly, well, I should call it Meta now, perhaps, because that includes their WhatsApp and Instagram. But those services are used regularly by billions of people. So that's not to be dismissed. And what lessons can we draw from that? And maybe we can rethink how those services can be offered without some of the big costs that are quite evident or becoming more evident.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think we could spend a long time talking about all the benefits, and I wrote a book that was mostly documenting upsides to new forms of social interaction and communication that were occurring because of these technologies. And I couldn't agree more. I think it's worth detailing. Let me explain a little bit what I think about the core beneficial changes that emerge on some of these platforms, and talk through a couple of them. I mean, one, it's undeniable that platforms have expanded markets in a manner that allowed far greater participation in them on both sides of markets, both as people selling goods and services and people trying to purchase goods and services. There's just no doubt, and I mean, Amazon's the classic example of that. And we can again talk about all the downsides of that, because there are some, I think, but that there are some clear positives to that, to expanding markets and opening them up in a way that increases participation in these kinds of economic exchanges, and that's clearly a positive. I think it's also, they've expanded speech in some critically important ways. We've moved from a world of media gatekeepers deciding whose voices were legitimate, whose voices deserved attention. And we've moved to a new model where many more people can speak and reach audiences. And that is clearly a beneficial thing as well. Again, we can talk about the way in which that functions and whose speech is prioritized and how now. But the reality is clearly that way more people can speak in that. And many people who were shut out of having public audience before due to the nature of the previous gatekeepers are now empowered in really meaningful ways. So markets are increased, speech is radically increased. And the third and maybe most important aspect I think that the platforms have enabled is new forms of collective action. And particularly collective action without hierarchical control. That it used to be for a long time, well, for the past century, the only way to get lots of people to do things together was to have hierarchical structure, command and control systems to make lots of people do things at once. And that's changed. There's new forms of collective action that are enabled on these platforms that have empowered groups that again were too often excluded from our public sphere. And so I think those are really important, powerful changes that we've experienced very quickly as a society. Last 20 years, we've gone through this radical transformation where power has shifted in some really meaningful ways. Now, we can talk about some of the downside risks of those, and I think where some of those technologies have evolved from their origins. But we, as you say, we can't lose sight of those really powerful benefits. Mm-hmm. In fact, those are what we need to preserve in our governance efforts. I mean, it comes full circle here, right? Like that's why I personally care so much about these policy debates right now, is I think if we get them right, they will hold on to those core attributes of these systems that are undeniable goods.
Well, I really agree with that, and I think that's a very important point, and we should not lose sight of that as we're trying to rein in. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Not that 100%. We're getting close to risking that at this point, but no. I've just mentioned, maybe not necessarily for discussion, but I'd say there's a number of other kinds of important services. For instance, access to information and knowledge of the fact that, you can look up and learn about so many things much more readily than you could before. Right. I mean, I think that's something that
absolutely. Absolutely.
They've shown that, and
which is sort of the flip side of expanded speech. Is that more people have access to speech.
Yes, exactly, exactly, and they can be more informed when they do speak, if they choose to.
Well, that's an open debate.
Yes, right. Okay, so let's turn to what do you think are the sort of the major harms that at least Canadian policymakers need to address. I mean, this is obviously a very large area, and you've already touched on a few of them, and we can go into some depth. But I'd like to just sort of scope out the kind of the range of issues that we might want to think about, so that if we're trying to address at least one issue, an individual issue, that we also think about, well, what does it mean in terms of other issues that we care about? What do you think are the top five?
Like you said, it's an incredibly broad. It's difficult to answer because, and this is intrinsic to some of the challenge we face, both as a society who embedded these technologies in our lives, but also a government that might want to better govern them, is that they aren't one thing. And then that gets back to the big aspect here, is that these companies touch on so many aspects of our lives and our economy and our healthcare system and everything. There's no aspect of our lives that isn't touched by these companies. That it means that the harms can be vast, right? Because it's not one thing we're trying to regulate here. It's a set of technologies that interact with our lives and our economy in all these different ways. Now, that being said, look, there's some things that I think clearly have risen to the surface over the past 5 years that we are increasingly aware of. The nature of speech online is clearly one. The way in which certain types of speech circulate and reach large audiences, and how they're incentivized to reach those audiences. The way certain types of potentially harmful speech, whether it be hate speech, a whole host of different speech that we make illegal in our society in various ways. The way it's incentivized, the way it circulates potentially inorganically through our society is something increasingly people are concerned of. The broad vulnerability of this ecosystem is a concern. It turns out that there's attributes of this system that are easy to manipulate if you're a foreign actor or a domestic actor even that might want to co-opt the public discourse in various ways and ways that are ultimately opaque, which is part of the challenge. I think there's real concerns around how the market is functioning on these platforms. Are these efficient markets? Are they leading to the kind of either labor we want? Are they abiding by the way we've evolved our labor markets over time? Is there legitimate competition in the market that means that that individuals can have some agency in how the market functions? I would argue there's some real deficiencies there. If we care about things like Canadian companies and scaling Canadian industry, is that possible in a market that is not functioning efficiently? So I think we can come at it from all different angles here. There are just our notions of privacy and the way data is used in our society, you know, much more than I do. But I mean, clearly we have the way we've traditionally brokered that bargain in our society between what is private and what is public, what data is used for commercial activity, that is changing. And probably our laws and regulations need to as well in ways that may seem innocuous at the moment, but as these technologies become more embedded in them, or we're giving more and more data, whether it be biometric or movement or whatever it might be, those harms become more increasingly apparent, I think, of losing our individual privacy within these technologies. So look, I think there's a lot of harms. There's no question about it, and we could go on for a long time listing them. The question is what's causing them, and I think that's where maybe our list becomes a little more concrete. And we get our hands around a little bit more.
Yes, I want to get into that next, but I mean, you've given a very nice list, or nice. I mean, it's a useful list of the major harms. I would add a couple that you haven't mentioned, and as you said, you could go on quite a bit longer. One I would mention is the way in which big tech approach to thinking about technological futures in a way sort of dominates our imagination, and I think sort of stunts our alternatives. And I think Mark Zuckerberg's presentation on the metaverse is an example, I mean, rather crude example of a particular vision that we really need to question as to where we want to go in the future, and in particular to think beyond sort of market and commercial approaches to how we would like a digital future. And another one that mentioned that's potentially very significant is the environmental impacts of this enormous digital machine, which consumes tremendous amounts of energy and resources from the earth. And there's a question as to whether that's sustainable, particularly in time of our climate crisis. So
I would echo both those. And I mean, on the second first, I mean, we tend to think of these as ethereal sort of services that are immaterial, and like you've pointed out through all your work, I mean, these are physical things. In your introduction, you mentioned that they're physical things based in physical locations that demand resources and capital and human labor to create and to make real. And that is not separate from our broader resource conversation. It's increasingly integral to it, I think. There's no doubt. And on the futures, I couldn't agree more as well. I mean, part of, and this is a long conversation, but I do think we need to discuss and debate in society who is defining those futures for us, and whether we have agency in that determination. Particularly, as I say, those of us who live in democratic societies and have the luxury of kind of making collective decisions together. What say do we have in these realities? And I actually think this move has been really clarifying in many ways this week. That just because a large company says it wants to build something that's going to transform all aspects of our society, does not mean it should, and not everything should be built. And I think we need to have some discussions about how and whether things should be built. I didn't notice this morning that Facebook has decided to back off from some of its facial recognition deployment across its platform. And we've seen that from a number of tech companies, that facial recognition becomes such a sort of albatross almost in the public discourse that they've backed away some of the deployment of facial recognition technology across their services. And like, there's an interesting case where I think it's something that companies were going to build, and many still are, of course. But citizens have had a say. And it turns out people are very, very uncomfortable with the powers that come with the realization of that technology. And I think that's important dialectic here, and we should be having on more things, frankly. I think we should be having about the metaverse, not just AI within the metaverse, but is this really something we as a society, is that a path we want to go down?
Yeah, exactly.
And these are conversations we need to have.
Yeah. Good. So you mentioned a moment ago that we could get more concrete when we look at sort of, I would say, sort of the underlying structural issues that are common across these various concerns and harms, and also the benefits, and try to understand better, how and why these companies have emerged and operate the way they do. Because it's kind of a banal point, but if you're going to try to tackle them, you have to understand them. And so I wonder if you could offer, again, this is a book length question, right? And people have tried this, but what do you think are the sort of the major structural features of the emergence of these platforms, big tech, that we need to understand if we're going to try to tackle them and redirect them and provide reasonable, viable alternatives?
So, I mean, I think, again, there's many directions we could go there, but at the root, much of it comes down to simply scale. That to make the business model of the platform ecosystem function needs just mind-boggling scale. You mentioned the amount of users on Facebook, apparently 2.7 billion. Billions and billions of transactions on Amazon every day. The scale that these companies are operating on is mind-boggling. And part of the reason for that and the need for that scale and that growth is the economic model that they are built on. Again, these are publicly traded companies that have a single motive, which is to make profit for shareholders. And they are tremendously good at making money. And the way they do that is by selling advertising. And that model of selling advertising needs just astronomical scale to function. And so I think really zeroing in on that, it takes us to some important places. For example, if you need huge scale to make a profit selling very, very cheap with very, very low margin advertising per view, then that might lead you to a certain set of policies that prioritize that growth and prioritize the time someone spends on your product over other attributes. So that might determine some of the character of the service you're providing, if that's your motive. It also might mean that you prioritize that scale and that growth over mitigating some of the downside harms that exist using that service in order to keep that growth high and that user engagement significant. So I think getting at scale takes us to some important places in this conversation. And it is, when we talk about the commonalities across these companies, it is very much a common attribute here. Mm-hmm. The desire for rapid growth to get to massive scale in the billions of users. And we've seen it outside of just our core big tech companies we generally talk about that you listed at the beginning, but I would say is even that's what's driven Uber and Spotify and like a much broader range of companies have all been driven by that need for rapid growth and scale. And I would argue to the exclusion often of proper accounting of some of the downside risks of the services they're providing.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think that's a really important point, but if scale is one of the sort of the underlying fundamental problems that's common across, I mean, one of the approaches to dealing with scale is to break these giants up. I mean, use antitrust measures and competition law in Canada so that they're smaller. Another approach would be to basically challenge the business model, the surveillance model that is the dynamic that drives that incentive. And our first speaker, Cory Doctorow, was all about busting them up. And making them, small and competitive with each other. I'm wary of that because I think you would have then lots of little businesses that are all just as madly trying to eke out revenues from advertising. If you can break that cycle of turning attention and people's data into what they call euphemistically engagement on your site, or at least eyeballs sticking to your site and driving clicks, then that would challenge scale in a very different way. You wouldn't. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be shouldn't use competition law, but do you see a prospect for that latter approach of trying to control, regulate the algorithms and the business models rather than the actual size of these enterprises?
Absolutely. So look, I mean, the quick answer is these are not mutually exclusive.
Of course.
And
but
look,
the discussion tends to get dominated by one or the other. It does,
and like Cory Doctorow and Shoshana Zuboff have this big back and forth, right? Where like one says regulate data and the other says regulate market activity. And like, why on earth wouldn't we do both? And neither are sufficient. And so I agree with both of them, right? And I agree with neither of them that these things are mutually exclusive. So there's no question there's more things going on here. Now, part of the challenge is we consistently look for silver bullets to this set of problems, and no one policy lever is going to solve for these like dozens of things we're talking about. And particularly against some of the biggest companies, again, as we said, in human history. It's going to take a package of governance mechanisms acting together in coordination with one another at both the domestic and the international level. And we can go through, I mean, I have my own ideas about what that package might look like, and there's lots of debates we can have about that. What's clear to me is it does need to be this sort of holistic approach that gets at the lack of competition in the market and where we think that might be concerning, gets at some of the data issues we've been talking about and modernizing our data governance in some important ways, and talking about content policy and what kind of content we want to moderate, incentivize across the system. And in each of these, there are some really ways we can get out, as you said, the structure. And I think that's where some of this latest conversation we've been having as a result of Frances Haugen's whistleblowing and testimony has been really effective, in my view, and important to change our debate a bit away from these silver bullets and towards some of these sort of accountability and transparency mechanisms that get at that core business model that functions on scale. And I do think if we we make those more transparent so that we and governments can see how these systems are functioning and get around some of this opacity that's been the root cause of a lot of problems here. And then hold companies accountable when they don't act in the public interest. And we'll be able to see, because of this transparency, that's going to get at some of the core here, and may make some of these other more difficult policy options less necessary. But yeah, look, I agree with both. I think there's some there's without doubt some market activity that needs to be regulated, and particularly in Canada, where we've been very hands-off. And as you know, our competition commissioner doesn't have a lot of power in this debate in Canada, and that's a real problem that needs to be corrected, I think. But it's also, of course, the reality that we as Canada are not going to lead to breakup of these companies. That's probably an American and European fight to fight. Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean we can't impose better competition policy in our country, though.
Mm-hmm. A couple of weeks ago, you had a Globe and Mail opinion piece with Beverly McLaughlin, among others, which was titled, "We Have the Tools to Fix Facebook." Now, you probably didn't make that headline, and that's probably the headline writer, but I wonder, and in that you mentioned prominently the need for transparency and accountability. Now, I'll take a little exception with you in terms of at least the title, whether that was your intention or not. Certainly we have some tools, but do you think the tools that we have, particularly around accountability, I mean, there's a lot that can be done around transparency, and transparency, I would say, is fundamental, it's necessary, but far from sufficient. And the difficult part gets to accountability. How do you call, even if we knew all that we needed to about how these companies operated and where they get their data from and who they transfer it to and what their algorithms are like, and in what ways do they promote and amplify inflammatory speech and things like that, which is an issue right now. Even if we knew a lot about that, we still need to hold them accountable to that. And can you say more about what you think those sort of accountability measures that could have a chance of being effective might be?
Absolutely.
Because some of that is within the Canadian realm. I mean, we can insist on some of these things if we have the will and we do it as part of a sensible package.
Yeah, I mean, look, I would change that headline to say we could have the tools we need to fix it.
Yes.
I mean, I think the point is that these are not sort of unimaginable powers, right? That are totally, and that this problem is unsolvable. And I think it's a new problem, and it's complicated and it's big, but it's not. But there's a path dependency that comes from the dismissiveness that we often have in these debates, that these are just unsolvable problems that are infinitely complex, that we as mere mortals and non-Silicon Valley based people could never understand, right?
And that they're so novel that we can't draw from our long history.
Exactly, that we haven't governed big company, global company. I mean, the one I reel at the most is, well, these are global companies. How can you possibly govern them? Well, we govern global companies all the time. I mean, that is, nations impose laws and regulations on global companies, and have for 100 years. That's not a unheard of construct. Now, how we hold these companies accountable is obviously really difficult, and there's multiple ways you can bring in accountability into the system. One, I think transparency measures in and of themselves could provide some accountability in the public. So part of the problem is a lot of these harms we're talking about, or some of the downside risks of using these technologies, are hidden from view. And if we were to make them more public and more visible to journalists and researchers and governments potentially, that in and of itself could provide some accountability, to daylight to this set of problems. So I think that is a form of accountability. Whether we think it's sufficient or not in a market that doesn't function, that's a different story. So correcting the market is actually an important piece of public accountability, in my view. So that's one form. Another is regulatory power. So in most jurisdictions that have engaged seriously in this regulatory conversation. They have assigned significantly more power to the regulator charged with regulating platforms, whether it's an existing regulator like Ofcom in the UK or a new regulator like in the case of the EU, and ultimately in what's being proposed in Canada. A key leverage point is ability to fine for non-compliance at a meaningful level. So part of the challenge we've had in the past is because these companies are so profitable and behave and operating at such a massive scale, the fines have just been rounding errors for them and able to be absorbed in just the normal course of business. But that's changing with the powers we're giving, the fining power we're giving to our regulators that are now calculating their fines based on percentages of global revenue. And that is a meaningful lever. If you're saying 4% of global revenue, that is a lot of money. And that has an effect. Now, it has varying effects, I think some pros and cons that we can talk about. And a third one, just briefly to mention, is liability. We impose liability in other sectors in very different ways than we have with platforms, and for some good reason. We've given platforms some shielding from liability of the behavior of their users. And that is a very controversial thing because it has empowered all sorts of many of those positive things we talked about are because companies aren't liable for everything every individual says and does. That is likely changing. And it's going to change in some important ways and differently in different jurisdictions. But I do think we're going to be talking about liability of algorithms, liability of particular people inside companies, liability of the company itself for the types of behavior and economic activity that it enables based on its design. And that is going to be part of this conversation.
Yeah, no, I agree with all of that. And these figures of 3% of global revenues or 4% or 5%. I mean, the EU, I think, started this, but Canada is also picking this up. I mean, that gets your attention. Or whether they can actually get those fines to stick through.
Yeah, we haven't seen that yet.
No, none yet.
Certainly not.
And we can expect, based on earlier finding of much more modest amounts of a few billion euros here and there, of years of litigation, because they and their legal teams are so.
Yes.
I mean,
yes. So that is true.
I'm just a little wary about seeing that as the really big stick. If the regulator can't effectively lift that stick off the ground to wield it in an effective way, just because it will require resources that are far beyond. So take the first.
Well, maybe we should think about providing more resources then to our regulatory. There's a possible argument there, but I think we also need to acknowledge that just because those fines aren't necessarily collected doesn't mean their presence doesn't change behavior. So one could say Facebook's backing off of the use of facial recognition is in part because of real potential liability here. Like, they're under investigation in multiple countries with a large number of both civil and government suits in place. Now, those fines were never collected, and they might never have been collected, but the presence of the regulatory regime and the potential liability opened up by them, in theory, can change behavior without ever being collected. But obviously,
I mean, more or less, I agree. But I think what your point about getting more resources to the regulator, in the case of the Canadian Office of the Privacy Commissioner, it gets revenue, or its budget is like 77 cents per year per Canadian. And if that is considered proportionate to the need for privacy protection in Canada, we've got a problem. It needs to be an order of magnitude more if you're going to actually take on these giants. Well, we're running out of time for this part, and we want to let people who are online to have a say here. So I'll just alert people who may be interested to, if you've got questions, please use the Q&A button and put those questions in, and Andrew will be monitoring that, and we'll get to those in a minute. So I'd just like to ask you sort of one final question, which is to make a recommendation. Who or what resources or podcast, books, anything you want that would be helpful to people who are following this debate and would like to learn more and get up to speed on that.
I think partly because this debate, as we've been talking through, is so multivariate. I think it's very difficult to find like a person or an idea here.
Yeah,
I'll give a
concept.
I find it's difficult to know how to enter this conversation because there's so many people with so many expertise coming at different dimensions of it. But at the moment, I find the platform governance discourse incredibly valuable, and for a few reasons. I think that we academics particularly, and I would say policy people as well, tend to come at these debates through existing disciplinary lenses. And so you've had in the internet governance conversation, a lot of people coming from specifically from the legal community or specifically from the infrastructure kind of communication side of things. And there is an emerging sort of interdisciplinary conversation that gets at this set of issues we've been talking at a more holistic level. And these are people who don't find homes in particular disciplines necessarily, in particular national discourses, and are really starting to struggle and are struggling to look at this set of issues from this global interdisciplinary perspective, which is ultimately where it's needed. So I think Chinmay Arun is a great example of that, and David Kay, and people who are just sort of thinking about these big global speech issues and big global legal platform governance issues from this broader, more holistic perspective I find really valuable at the moment. It gets us away from some of these really siloed specific debates that each on their own are insufficient to deal with this problem.
Well, thank you. You've written a paper for CG on platform governance, so I recommend that, which gives a survey, and also, as I mentioned earlier, a big tech podcast that begins in 3 weeks. So I'd add those to the list. So I believe we have some questions, Ange, so fire away.
Yeah, I do want to remind attendees that they can use the Q&A button to ask questions. And the first question is from Marco. And Marco asks, you've claimed Canada as a national government can regulate the behavior of a global corporation like Google or Facebook as it has other multinationals. But unlike a multinational that has a factory in Canada that can be regulated, these companies' production occurs globally. So how can the government of Canada, for example, regulate the operation of the Facebook algorithm or the Google search engine for Canadians?
It's a good question. And it is, and again, gets to the point that these are not necessarily directly analogous to past problems we've had. These are a new set of technologies. But look, the idea that these companies don't operate in any meaningful way in our own jurisdiction also needs to be pushed back against a bit. I mean, Facebook and Google sell a product in Canada, which is their advertising, and they enable speech and political activity, which are both regulated in certain ways in our economy, in our country, with people who participate who are in Canada. So I mean, they have servers that are based in Canada, right? So they are in our jurisdiction in meaningful ways. Now we can talk about whether like any one of those specific things can be regulated or should be regulated, but they can, and it may have consequence. So a great example is leading up to the 2019 federal election. The federal government, which has very aggressively regulates speech during an election and regulates political advertising during an election, expanded some of these regulations to the sale of internet ads or ads on platforms. and which is, they have every right to do so, and did, and I actually think had some positive consequences. But Google decided to simply not sell political ads during the election in Canada, which is also entirely their right to do so. They just said, okay, you're going to regulate speech in this way during the election. Well, that's overly cumbersome for us to sell our product in Canada during that time period. And that's perfectly fine. So there are costs sometimes. People weren't able to buy and sell political ads during that 5 weeks in 2019 on Google. But it's every right, and we have every capacity to do so, because that is an actual thing that is bought and sold in the Canadian market that the government regulates. So there's all sorts of examples, I think, of how we, using existing tools or the slight evolution of existing tools, we can bring them into these new goods and services that are being provided by these companies.
Good. Ange, if you have another question.
Yeah, the next question is from Marta. Marta asks, if you were the new heritage minister, what would you be bringing forward to deal with the online harms that are having such a negative impact on many Canadians?
That's a big question, and
Yeah,
look,
and I'm glad it came up.
yeah, and let me get at this by sort of reflecting a little bit on what was been proposed in Bill C-36 and what I think was good about it first. And I think in my view, and this is, I agree that I admit this is sort of contested, but my view is that the broad regulatory architecture or governance architecture that was proposed is generally something I would support. And I would say there's 3 different pieces that were proposed in that legislation. One was a new regulatory body, so a new commissioner to be an internet regulator. And I actually think it's important to have that. The choice was to expand the powers of an existing regulator, like the CRTC, or which is what the UK did, or to create a new body that's kind of purpose built for this set of challenges. And I think that latter model is better from my perspective. So one piece of that architecture is this internet regulator. Another is what you might call, they called a recourse council, but you might call it sort of some sort of e-court system for adjudicating both takedown and non-takedown decisions from platforms themselves. And that's important, I think, because we need to democratize some of these content moderation decisions that these companies make on our behalf. Now we can talk about the mechanics of how they work and how this might be structured and whether it's fast enough or too fast and all these things. But I think that's important. And the third piece of this architecture that I do think is helpful is what a lot of people call social media councils. They're calling an advisory board, which is kind of a group of stakeholders who will advise the government and advise the new regulator and study the impacts of their regulations and their decisions in order to provide sort of important feedback loop there, because this is a new space. So it's an important accountability mechanism for the regulator itself. So that's all to say, I think those 3 things are not a bad package of regulatory tools to use. The question is, what do you empower them to do? And here is where I have some more problems with this. And so the 3 things that I think are really problematic about what was proposed are the regime of rapid takedown, mandatory takedowns. They put, like Germany did, they imposed a 24-hour takedown regime on 5 categories of already illegal content. The challenge with this, as we know from other jurisdictions, is it leads to over censoring. And that's clearly been the case in Germany, where this has been tried. Many people who consulted the government or asked for their opinions on this in the lead up to this legislation pointed this out, and yet they pushed through with it. And I think that was a mistake, and one that I would recommend they correct. A second is an IP blocking provision, which I think is worrying. You understand their motive. They said that, look, if a platform is totally non-compliant to our new regulator and the laws of the land, surely we should have a way of turning that platform off and sort of banning them from the Canadian market in a meaningful way or restricting them from the Canadian market in a meaningful way. The problem is the way you do that on the internet is by forcing telecoms to block the IP of those companies, which, as Andrew knows far better than I do, has all sorts of spillover effects of giving that kind of power to our IP provider or our telecom providers in the country. So like that's risky. I don't understand why they thought they needed to bring that in, but I think the downstream risks of that are way exceed those very narrow potential use cases. And the third is something others can speak to much better than I can, but it's around the new mandatory reporting and data sharing provisions that are in the legislation between platforms and the security services in Canada, whether it be RCMP or CSIS. And I think, as others have pointed out more effectively than I can, this is a real scope creep of this legislation that goes well beyond just the regulation of new online speech laws and into a whole host of security issues and intelligence issues that are beyond the scope of this regulation. I think need to be discussed on their own merits. So the three things I would do is I would change all three of those things. I would keep the architecture, probably consult more on what the powers should be given to that architecture, and get rid of those three things.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you, Taylor. I wonder to what extent you think, though, that its proposals are a bit off of the government, are a bit off base in that they appear to pretty much exclusively focus on regulating content and not algorithmic amplification or the business models that make, let's say, harmful speech much more dangerous and much more of a issue than if it wasn't amplified in the ways that these platforms have control over. There's, as you were mentioning earlier, that these companies have been left sort of unregulated about and given free of liability for what happens in terms of the speech on their site. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they shouldn't be held liable for the ways in which they amplify and selectively push content. And my sense of that bill, and also frankly of the report from the Canadian Commission on Democratic Expression, which you're now going to be part of, focuses understandably on issues of content, but is relatively light on showing an understanding of the ways in which these algorithmic processes make legal, but maybe objectionable speech more harmful. And if those can be addressed, then I would suggest, and maybe you agree with me or not, that this would shrink down the scope of what is now getting people excited, rightfully so, to something that's much more manageable and where you can have a more tailored approach and get away from the chilling effect of these platforms, over censoring to avoid the risk that something that they will get dinged on will slip through. What do you think of that?
I agree with you entirely. I think it's completely understandable why governments and the public and journalists focus on these outcomes, these symptoms, because these speech acts are the things we feel and see, and they're kind of the visceral product of this system. And so the tendency is to deal with them first, because they seem like the thing that needs to be stopped and put back in the bottle. When the reality is just as you suggest, that actually there's a set of incentives and design decisions and financial models that in many ways create that problem, that are the causes of it. And so how do you hold that accountable? Now, I actually think that is something that our new regulator could be empowered to do. So this year in this commission that you mentioned, that's what we're looking at, is like, if you had this architecture of these three tools, and particularly the commission, this new regulator, what might you empower them to do to provide more accountability and transparency in the system, including the ability to audit algorithms, including mandatory risk and harm assessments, including data sharing with researchers and the public, including the things that, including better oversight of the financial model through ad transparency mechanisms. So all of these things are much more targeted at the structure. And I agree with you. If we do those first, we might have a much more manageable speech problem. And there will still be, I'm sure, illegal speech circulating. But as you say, it will be more manageable, and it will we'll be able, perhaps be more targeted in how we address it. The other piece of that, though, is that it could be that providing some of those accountability and transparency measures doesn't have to happen through that regulator. So this is where I think we could have a debate. Like, it's arguable that our new empowered privacy commissioner with new, yet to be seen, fully resolved privacy laws in this country could take on some of that role. I mean, algorithmic transparency could be embedded in C11, for example, not C36. I mean, to get specific about that, right? Or some of those financial models could be arrived at through reforms to the Competition Act, or new powers given to the Competition Commissioner to see into the financial workings of these companies. So it doesn't have to happen through an internet regulator. In fact, some of it might be spread out across different pieces of legislation and different regulatory bodies. But the point stands that I think you're right. Getting at the structure is what we should be focusing our attention on, rather than the outcomes. Yes,
and I think what you're talking about there is the more holistic approach that you're talking about.
Absolutely.
And speaking personally as a certified computer scientist, it's well, I just say it brings music to my ears to hear the word algorithm used in public discourse for the first time that I can recall in decades. And I'm glad that people are beginning to talk about and to think about the ways in which these computational systems, shape what we see. The other half of algorithm is data. I mean, they need each other in order to do anything, and that's lesson one in computer science. Is algorithms plus data is computation, and it's computation that is really what's going on here at enormous scale. But this example suggests to me that is poorly understood, even after we've been into this, the digital turn for several decades now. But if we can, I think, help people understand better what computation means in these contexts, its benefits and consequences, and not get quite as distracted as we, understandably are by the peripheral effects, or I don't say they're peripheral, but these are the symptoms that we will then be able to better understand and regulate this phenomena across the wide range of sort of issues that we need to deal with. So
I think that's right, and I don't think we should have any pretense that simply making algorithms visible or public will solve this problem. I mean, these aren't easy challenges. I mean, these are very complex systems that are evolving in real time and are based on just massive data flows, right? So like this isn't an easy task, but it's the right task, I think, to get at the nature of the design of these systems and the way those designs and those incentives play into the product we experience, and the effect that has on our lives is to me the right conversation to be having anyway, as a starting point.
Good. Ange, do we have another question?
Yeah, we do. The next one is from Jan. Jan asks, most of the offensive speech that troubles people is the kind of speech on which the major platforms' business models depend. How do you solve the problem without their business models changing?
Well, I don't think you do. I think, no, that doesn't mean the businesses still won't be immensely profitable. I think the question is, what responsibility is imposed on these companies to make this problem smaller? You're not going to get rid of it all. Content moderation is not going to solve all of these problems. But at the moment, there's very little incentive other than potential public outcry or bad press for this problem to be invested in. And again, there's analogies to previous industries here. I mean, we have imposed requirements, like safety requirements, on other industries that have decreased their profit margins, but they still remained profitable entities. The question is, what's that profit margin, and is enough being invested in trust and safety? Facebook makes $80+ billion a year. How much of that is put into content moderation? A lot, but is it enough for the scale in which they're operating? That's something we can have a say on. So look, I think the inevitable outcome here is that these aren't quite as profitable companies, but that shouldn't be our concern. Our concern is to ensure that products are safe and that are aligned with our democratic interests. And the question of profitability is a different one.
Great, thanks. Ange, do we have another question?
Yeah, the next one is from George, and George asks, could you elaborate on the dangers to the use of IP blocking provisions?
Yeah, I mean, the core is that it potentially undermines the principles of net neutrality that have been a driving force of the open internet since its existence, which is that we all have access to the same information, and that the people who provide us access to the internet, the telecoms, don't have a say in what content we see. They can't act as choke points on the internet. And that's sort of a core operating principle. Now we can argue whether that's always the case, and there are actually some ways in which we've undermined that principle. But the idea that these telecoms can completely block access to a set of content online undermines that core principle in a way that's pretty worrying. And in particular, because it incentivizes them, or actually force them in the case of this, to build out the technical capacity to do it. And once that capacity is there, there's an arguable slippery slope to be used for other things. Now, it's worth arguing the theoretical or the hypothetical situation that the government's dealing with there is, what if you have a platform that is just totally not abiding by Canadian law, and say is like allowing foreign interference in our election, or is allowing the spread of child pornography in our society, and no amount of fine is stopping their action? What do you do about that edge case? Surely there should be a way of turning them off in Canada. And that's the kind of the hypothetical situation they're talking about. Whether or not that's worth building out this entire capacity and infrastructure for is an open question. And look, Andrew would know way more about this than I would. This is in his core.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's I think an illustrative example of IP blocking when the TELUS workers were on strike and had not the union itself, but somebody else put up a website that was supporting the strike, and TELUS, I mean, if I got this right, it's some years ago now, but they decided to take down this inconvenient website, and they blocked a range of IPs, or the IP address of the server in which it was hosted, and in so doing took down a whole lot of other quite legitimate sites. So there's an evidence that if this power is easily available to telecoms or to those who are giving them direction, this can be used very widely with collateral damage that may not be foreseen. And since your IP address, I mean, either as a user, I mean, an individual as we are now, we all have a particular IP address for this conversation, and the servers and the other resources that we access, they all have unique IP addresses. That's your identity. And if you can wipe out with a stroke of a click, basically, if they build out this capacity to automate it, it's something that happens often, then that's a very dangerous power that would need to be used very selectively and for very good reasons if there were no reasonable alternatives. So before we open up that door, let's see if there are other ways in which we can solve these edge cases without having to, basically open the barn door in a way.
Yeah.
Andrew, I think we have time for another question or two.
Yeah, the next question is from Ben, and Ben asks, content moderation may seem like a good answer, but doesn't that just allow the platforms to become the censors of our society if what they moderate is only expression that is clearly illegal?
So I would argue they already are shaping speech and really in a whole host of meaningful ways.
Mm-hmm.
As is their right, they're private entities. The question is how they do that moderation, to what degree that moderation is transparent, and to what degree that moderation aligns with national laws or domestic jurisdictions and accounts for the differences between them. And that's where I think the policy debate also ultimately is right now. But look, there is no question that we have outsourced the moderation of speech in some meaningful ways to these companies. The challenge is we just don't know how that moderation is being done. We don't know if it's necessarily abiding by our own laws. And I think we have every right to demand that it's both more transparent and probably that it's invested in to a greater degree on their part. So I don't know. I mean, one of the challenges, so there is a problem that these are the de facto, we've sort of privatized our public sphere in some meaningful ways here. And we've done it to a fairly small number of companies. And that's why these problems are interconnected. That you might argue that if there was more competition in how companies moderate their content, we might get positive incentives that would lead to better moderation and to different forms of moderation. And I think that's why competition policy is ultimately part of this too.
Andrew, I think we have time for one more question if you have one.
There is actually no more questions at this point. So.
Oh, okay. Well, then I would invite Taylor, if you want to make any closing remarks. Is there anything sort of the burning that you think would be really good for us to hear that you haven't already said? We could go on for actually several hours. Yes, we covered a lot of grounds, but sometimes things come up.
I think we've covered a lot of ground here. I think there were what I would just say that like this conversation reflects, and I think a lot of conversations recently have reflected, is that we're finally having the right conversations, I think. And I think for many years we weren't. And I'm sort of heartened that for a host of different reasons, there's just an awareness of these challenges. And governments are having finally the right conversations about how to govern this, what is sort of an integral part of our society at the moment. So I'm appreciative that we have the chance to have these conversations.
Mm-hmm. Well, I certainly agree with that. Is there any particular initiative that you can cite in Canada or elsewhere that you find particular hope in, or that offers kind of a promising direction?
I mean, so as a sort of partner project to the commission that we've talked about is a citizens assembly on democratic expression that is being run by Peter McLeod, and we're going into the second year of it right now. And I have to say that it's been very eye-opening to me. It's as both a process, as a deliberative democratic process, but also it's really demonstrated that the public cares about these topics and the things we're talking about, and that the more they're exposed to these debates and to this set of policy debates, the more they are supportive of new forms of governance. And that transformation is quite remarkable. That these citizen assemblies have sort of 50 or so randomly selected, demographically grounded citizens from across the country, and And they go through this process of 6 months really studying these issues. And I find it remarkable that the more people learn about these set of challenges, the more they care about them, and the more they support and encourage and demand our governments do something about them. And to me, that's really encouraging, both on the topic and that I think there is a sort of, the more people learn about this, the more they care, which is a good sign for those of us who communicate these issues to the public with that hope. But the other is just as a pure democratic process. I find it really, really encouraging. That deliberative democracy works, I think. And the more we talk about these things and think them through in careful ways, the better outcome we'll get to.
Right. Well, I think that's a terrific place to end. We'll put a link to the Citizens Assembly and the posted material. Is there a report coming out anytime soon?
Yeah, the second year report of the Assembly will be out in January. And it's actually this year, they'll interestingly do one of your early questions looking at liability and what kind of legal liability should be placed on platforms, which is a fairly esoteric legal debate, but will be the one that this group of citizens is diving into. So it'll be fascinating to see what they come to.
Okay, well, I want to thank you, Taylor, for a very stimulating discussion. I think you've really helped lay out the landscape that we will explore in further depth over the coming season. But you've really provided, I think, a good guide for this.
Well, thanks to you.
Yeah, and Ange will be posting a recording tomorrow to the podcast section of the Center for Free Expression's website, as well as its YouTube channel. And you'll find links to the materials that we've mentioned in our conversation. If you found this session valuable as I have, please tell your friends and even foes about it. They should know about it. And if you have any feedback about what you liked or didn't like, or any suggestions for future topics or guests or resources that we should know about, please email us. The CFE email is on its website, I believe. Mine is andrew.clement@utoronto.ca, and I would welcome whatever you have to say. I'm hoping you found this as stimulating as I have, and that you'll join me on December 8th at the same time for the next event in the Taming Big Tech series. I'll be talking with Jamil Jaffer, an expert and very effective advocate for free expression, freedom of expression, and we'll tackle the question, how should democracies regulate speech online? Some of the topics we've begun to get into, but obviously we can do so in much greater depth. So thanks, Taylor. Thanks, Ange. Thanks you all for your attention, and back to you, Jim.
Well, thank you very much, Andrew and Taylor. It was quite an engaging discussion and an important one. And I'd like to thank the audience for joining us too, and for your questions. As Andrew mentioned, the video of today's conversation will be posted on our website tomorrow, along with some suggestions if there's for further reading you might do if you're interested in pursuing some of the things discussed. Our next event will be looking at another aspect of the impact of social media, how it's affecting our relationship with our employers. The conversation is titled, "Watch What You Say, The Whole World is Becoming Your Workplace." It will be next Monday, November 8th at 4 p.m. Charles Smith and Daniel J. Perret, whose work has explored this issue in some detail, will be discussing how social media is breaking down the boundary between the workplace and life outside of work, with employers monitoring and disciplining employees for non-workplace expression, what this means for each of us and what can be done. So I hope you'll join us then next Monday, November 8th at 4 p.m. For more information about past events, as well as our many upcoming events, please go to our website, which is cfe.ryerson.ca, and you'll find it there. Thank you very much for coming. Goodbye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.